Let's get it.
Never saw it coming. Yet he 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 never saw it coming.
A little bit in the life of my life.
There it goes again.
Welcome to
I thought y'all knew.
I am your host, Tyrone Bridges.
Welcome to I Thought You Knew. I am your host, Tyrone Bridges, and I have a very special guest in the studio here today. I have Washtenaw County Sheriff candidate for Sheriff Ken Magee. Say hello, Ken.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on the show today, Tyrone.
All righty. Without further ado, I'd like to ask you, why are you running for sheriff?
Well, I've got over 30 years of experience in law enforcement, and I moved back to the Washtenaw County area about 14 years ago, and I saw a lot of things that had changed. And as I continued to monitor things, I see more things changing, and not for the better. And we'll talk about some of those things, but I want to make a change in this county. I want to make a difference in law enforcement, and I see a lot of potential for that.
Awesome. Next thing I'd like to ask is your resume. How is your resume?
Well, my resume is pretty extensive. As a matter of fact, we just posted my resume online. Part of my campaign promise is accountability and transparency. So when we take a look at my resume, which is this 4-page document right here, this will be online for everybody to view. But let me talk about it briefly. 30 years of law enforcement experience plus. Started as a cop in Jackson, Michigan, worked there about 4 years. And then after that, I became a federal agent. And after that, I became a chief of police at the University of Michigan. So I have local, national, and international experience in law enforcement.
All right, wonderful. So could you tell us about the NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, proposed by the Sheriff Department, and the validity of that, and why should you not have that in the Sheriff?
Well, I have heard about the NDAs that the sheriff is trying to place on the employees there, so they don't talk about some of the things that transpire at the Sheriff's Department. And that flies in the face of one of my platform pieces, accountability and transparency. I don't know the exact specifics of it, but I've heard about it. But under my administration, there will be no NDAs for day-to-day business. Do we want to keep things in-house as much as possible so we can do our job? Do we want to make sure we don't talk about active investigations? Of course, that's just good police work. But to put a muzzle on your employees where they can't talk about anything, that flies in the face of accountability and transparency and almost creates a Gestapo type of police force. You can't talk. And there's a lot of reasons they're doing that right now, because the employees there are very disgruntled for a lot of reasons, and we'll talk about those later.
All right. And your opponents is currently Alicia Dyer and Derek Jackson.
Exactly. Well, what about them?
All righty. I understand there's some inconsistency in one of your opponents' resume.
Well, in reality, in both opponents' background, I think there's some inconsistencies. And in today's day and age, investigative journalism has almost died. It's not out there. But thankfully, we have people like you, people like Shannon, and people like the Ann Arbor Independent that are out there asking the hard questions and fact-checking people's statements. So why don't we talk about some of those? Let's talk about some of the statements that have been made earlier. All right? It's pretty clear to me that in the case of both of my opponents, they have embellished an awful lot. And I'm here to set the record straight. And I come with receipts as well. So let's talk about it. How about Alicia Dyer, right off the bat? Let's talk about her. Alicia Dyer, again, I want to speak more about myself today, but you've asked me the question and I need to clarify some things. Alicia Dyer says that she's been in police work for 10 years. And during your interview the other day, she said she left halfway through her career to go out west and then come back. But let's talk about halfway through her career. She says she's got 10 years of police experience. Well, in reality, working the street, she has 6 years and 4 months. And the data is right there on the screen. That's an official document from the Michigan Commission for Law Enforcement Standards. And it shows the breakdown as to exactly how many months she actually worked. That's right there in black and white. You can see it on the screen. So when you take a look at, she worked for 2 years and 11 months, and then 3 years and 5 months after a 90-day hiatus. And you can inquire with her as to why she took that 90-day hiatus between those two jobs. But to say that she left halfway through her career, I want to point out the fact that you are on probation for at least the first year, and some people for 18 months. So in reality, if you're on probation for a year, right when you get hired, like all employees are, they go through the field training officer program. That in and of itself is like a learning cycle. So when you take away that year, she really has 5 years and 4 months on the street. Okay, she now tries to add the time she worked as a Marine deputy, which is out working on the waters here in Washtenaw County. I'm going to give her the credit for that she says she's worked them, but I'm not going to give her a whole year's credit when it's a summertime, part-time job.
Spring,
But
summer.
but she's trying to stretch that to give herself 10 years because it's more marketable. At the end of the day, we take a look at those numbers, and she has 6 years and 4 months, right there in black and white on the MCOLS document, and then you can say whether it be 3 years or 4 years, working 3 to 4 months a year on the high seas, basically, is what I'm saying, and that's tongue-in-cheek. But there's really not, it's not like working the streets, okay?
Right.
That's number one. Number two, you've got a person that just went into social work, got her degree, things of that nature, and she parlays all those years of social work experience. And there's not many of those either. You can only have so much time over the course of a decade and a couple of years to have the experiences. So, is she a licensed social worker? I believe she is. Is she a licensed police officer? Yes, she is. But the embellishment comes in how long she's been doing it. I watched the training. I watched your video where you talked about training, and you'll probably ask me about my training as well. And the majority of the training that she listed are basic police training techniques that everybody gets in the academy and every officer has on the street. She mentioned about leadership program at the University of Michigan, the Ross School of Business. Well, a lot of cops go through leadership programs, and the difference between me and her is that I have actually put that law enforcement experience and all that training to work, where I've been an executive and a supervisor for well over 20 years. And the one question, and there's another document, and that is, I'm concerned about these years of experience and the embellishment. For example, I have another document where she did not pass the sergeant's examination. So she didn't pass the sergeant's examination, and the analogy given to me once is that once you take a look at all of this data and information, you basically have a social worker that had police experience and equates it to a student teacher wanting to become the principal. And that's the analogy I give. I believe she's a good person. I believe she has a good heart. I believe she wants to do things. But frankly, the experience is not there. And so to embellish the experience is basically disingenuous to the voters. And I have a problem with that.
All right, now your other opponent. Let's talk about Derek Jackson and his missteps.
Well, his missteps is that he's done two major things, and that is, and they're both things that we can look at. Number one is he's referred to himself as a police officer frequently. And I called him out a while ago at a forum. And I basically said, you can go to law school and not be an attorney. You can go to medical school and not be a doctor. And you can go to the police academy and really not be a police officer. And I said, you're not a police officer. Why do I say that? He went to the academy. Absolutely. Was he certified? Yes. Was he given a badge? Absolutely. Has he ever made an arrest? No. Has he ever completed a field training officer program? No. Has he ever worked in a patrol car? No. Has he ever supervised an investigation? No. He's never even done an investigation. And when you're a cop, you've lived the life of being a police officer, whether it be 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, 30 years in my case, plus. You have a certain belief, there's a certain way you live, a certain style of what you believe in. And for someone to say that they're a cop when they didn't push all those buttons to get to where other cops have gotten, it's a problem. So a good example of this, in 2013, one of the major missteps that Derek Jackson did was He wrote a letter to the judge in a case on Washtenaw County letterhead, and that letter, which you see on the screen right now, was basically asking for leniency for an individual that was involved in a series of crimes to include stolen weapons, drive-by shootings, and then shooting at a police officer, 2 police officers. He wrote a letter on Washtenaw County Sheriff's letterhead asking for leniency for that person.
Wow.
So when you do that, and you're now also saying you're a police officer who's working and directing things at the sheriff's department, you have lost the respect of every single employee there. You cannot do that. And the prosecutor was furious at this. The officers were furious. I spoke to one of the officers who went in and saw Derek Jackson and said, "Why did you do this? I've worked for you. I've been loyal to you. This guy tried to kill me." And Derek gave some sort of excuse that it was an accidental shooting. And the type of gun is a Smith & Wesson XD, I believe was the actual serial number, where you have to hold the handle and squeeze the handle before you pull the trigger. It's very hard to have an accidental shooting. And the officer was grazed, the bullet whizzed by him, and that's a very traumatic thing for an officer. So you had an officer that almost died, and the person that almost killed him is now receiving a letter, is getting a letter on his behalf, and that's a huge. So no matter what Derek Jackson's platform is, he will never succeed because he does not have the respect of the law enforcement officers that work there. And he never will because of that. Combined with the fact that he calls himself a police officer and he's really never worked the streets and never done what any cop does. So how can you lead a group of people not experience what they've been through?
And he never put any cuffs on nobody.
Never. So the second major misstep is, and slowly but surely this is coming out. Now I have a concern with this. He's referred to himself for years as a social worker. He's not a licensed social worker. There is no license for Derek Jackson. He puts on his resume he's a social worker. I have a problem with that. And so do social workers that I have met.
Wow.
And right now I'm aware of complaints that have been made against Derek Jackson with the state of Michigan, with the social worker disciplinary review board, as well as the Attorney General's office, asking them to look into this matter. It's huge. Depending on how you look at it, impersonating a social worker and what you've done in that role of impersonating is a felony or a misdemeanor. And that's very, very concerning to most people, especially to serious social workers who have worked an entire career at what they do. And a lot of this was brought to my attention by social workers in the field, that they have a concern about somebody saying that they have these credentials. He says he has a master's degree in social work. I'm not doubting that. But you still had to get licensed. You still had to go through the 1,000 hours or $2,000 and the continuing ed and testing and things of that nature after you get your master's degree. Okay?
Wow.
So those are missteps. And these are embellishments on behalf of Ms. Dyer and Mr. Jackson that I have serious concerns about. I don't have to embellish my career. I've done it. I've done an awful lot in my career. And normally I don't talk about it. But when you run for office, you've got to talk about it. And so I'm just trying to set the record straight. I would be much happier if they would just be honest instead of having to be called out about it. It would be much easier to then say, okay, now that you're not embellishing and you're telling the truth, let's talk about our various platform ideas, versus hearing someone embellish their careers. Both of those embellishments would disqualify you for a job if you were applying for a police job now. If you embellish like that in a police interview, you would not qualify. And both of my opponents would not even qualify to be a small town police chief, let alone the head of Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department. In fact, they wouldn't qualify to be a sergeant either because they don't have the experience. Derek has never led anything dealing with law enforcement. And Alicia, I'm sorry, she even didn't pass the sergeant's examination.
Wow.
So let's get to me more now and talk about my platform, my ideas, and my background and some of my experiences, if you don't mind. But hopefully that answered your question about the concerns that I have about them.
Well, let's do that. Let's talk about your background and your history, law enforcement, and the things that you've been doing
Sure, sure, sure. Well, let's talk about the background. I was born and raised in Ann Arbor. My mother was a social justice warrior here. She was a social worker as well. And my father was a neurologist at the University of Michigan. I went through Angel, Tappan, and Huron. I met some great mentors that ultimately convinced me to go into law enforcement. I even went to a law enforcement career camp when I was 16 years old, put on by the Ann Arbor Police and the State Police and the Kiwanis. And then I ended up going off to Michigan State University, got my bachelor's and master's degree. I graduated first in my class in college. I went to the police academy. I was the president of the academy, graduated first in my class there as well. I excelled. I found something that I loved doing. I laugh about it. I barely got out of high school at Ann Arbor Huron High. I barely got out, class of 76. Go Rats. But the thing was, I wasn't challenged. I didn't have an interest or a passion. And then once I found it, it was awesome. And the rest has been a wonderful ride. So I became a police officer in Jackson, Michigan. I worked the streets in Jackson. And it was at that time I had several situations occur, but I excelled. Sadly, I had a police officer shot and killed. I was with him when he died. I had a firefighter die in front of me. The building collapsed next to us. He died. I lived. And so the age of innocence was over at the age of 22. So when I talk about living that life of being a police officer, these are the things that shape my opinions. And you'll hear more here in a minute. So when we go back to my qualifications, then what happened was I ended up getting the eyes of the federal government. I applied. I became a federal agent. I was assigned to Detroit to work undercover as a narcotics agent. I was the undercover agent on the largest drug deal in the history of Michigan. 600 kilograms of cocaine almost were seized, as well as, well, we seized 576 kilograms of cocaine. And we convinced Colombians to fly an airplane to Michigan to deliver all this cocaine. And it was a great deal. It was a great investigation, and it set records. And it also ended up getting me a promotion to go to Bogota, Colombia. So I learned Spanish. I spent 7 months in Spanish language school, which is a trait and a skill that I still possess. I speak with my daughter in Spanish all the time. I speak Spanish all the time. And today, with our immigration community, I'm able to communicate with them effectively. And it's a skill that I will always practice and always have. But I went to Bogota, Colombia for 7 years. And some of the highlights of being in Bogota, people say, what was it like being in Bogota? And I say, being in Bogota was like being an astronaut and on the moon shuttle mission when you went to the moon. It's like you are there in the thick of things. So some of the highlights there. I captured an FBI top 10 fugitive by the name of Armando Garcia, who was a corrupt police officer. And you know who hates corrupt police officers the most? Good police officers. So I captured Armando Garcia with my partner. And when I say I, it's always a team effort. But I happen to be the leader or the co-leader of the team in all the scenarios that I'm going to talk about. So captured an FBI top 10 fugitive. I captured a hitman that murdered 33 people. And I talked about my mother. And this is the compassionate side of me. When we were taking him to jail, I went to the drive-thru and I got him a sandwich. My partner thought I was crazy. He said, what are you doing? I said, hey, tonight we'll celebrate. There's not many people that murder 33 people, and let alone cops that get to arrest them. We're one of few in the world. So tonight we'll celebrate. He's going to jail cell 5 feet by 5 feet in Puerto Rico, made out of concrete, with a hole in the ground to go to the bathroom. That they come in once a week with a power hose and wash it down. I said, let's get him his last meal. So then as we continue on to the credentials on some of the things that happened in Bogota, I arrested a guy by the name of Armando Garcia. Oh no, I talked about Armando Garcia. I arrested a guy by the name of Rene Benitez. Rene Benitez kidnapped and shot 2 DEA agents. And I made it my mission to capture him. And after 13 years after this heinous crime, I captured Rene Benitez and got him back to the United States, my partner and I. So then other highlights working in Colombia was, one of the main highlights was being involved in the Pablo Escobar investigation. I was the assistant supervisor, and we worked very hard. And Pablo Escobar was the world's most notorious criminal, biggest criminal the world has ever seen or will ever see. And I was fortunate to be part of this small team. You might understand Pablo Escobar a little bit more if you've watched the Narcos series on Netflix. I was part of the Pablo Escobar investigation, one of a small team of 6 DEA agents in Bogota, Colombia.
I actually seen that video of you on YouTube.
Okay, I've talked about that. And the Narcos Netflix, Steve Murphy and Javier Pena were the 2 agents depicted. And Hollywood has its creativity that they do. So they basically framed the whole story around 2 guys, but I can assure you it took more than 2 guys to take down Pablo Escobar. Right. But Javier and Steve are both friends of mine, and I appreciate what they did to let the world know about the Escobar family. For example, a good example is Pablo Escobar was sending his family to Germany, and he wanted them to escape Colombia. So I was the agent following the family to Germany, and we met with the Germans. We got the Escobars kicked out and returned back to Germany within 24 hours, or to Colombia within 24 hours. Once we got them returned, Pablo started making phone calls. Make a long story short, triangulation techniques, investigative strategies. Pablo was located, a shootout ensued, Pablo was killed, and the world changed right at that moment in 1993. But in the Narcos series, they've got Steve following the family to Germany. In real life, it was me. So they compartmentalized a lot of, and incorporated a lot of positions for a lot of different people. So it's what they call a docudrama. Some of it's drama that they create, and some of it's real life. What's really clear is Pablo Escobar was one badass dude and one of the world's worst criminal ever. And I've given this analogy. If Al Capone was alive at the same time Pablo Escobar was, Al Capone may have been able to be one of his drivers. May have been.
Wow.
So Colombia, great experience. We've talked about some of the highlights there. There were other highlights of being in Colombia. For example, we created strategies to fight crime, whether it be smuggling of illegal weapons or guns, all sorts of explosives, counterfeit money investigations, drug investigations, and creating strategies to capture fugitives throughout the country. So it was a great time. So after 7 years, then I went out to the East Coast, and then the West Coast. I'm sorry, the West Coast first, and then the East Coast. During those times, I was assigned to our Washington, D.C. office, where I ran an intelligence unit, had a group of people working for me. And on the East Coast, I also ran a unit and had a group of people working for me there. During that time, I was also assigned to the Olympics in 1996 for anti-terrorism, and I was the only agent ever to testify against Eric Rudolph, the Olympic Park bomber, because I was next to the bomb when it went off. I still have inner ear trauma, but we were able to perform life-saving aid to this young girl, little 13-year-old girl. Her name was Fallon Stubbs. Her mother was killed by the blast, who was 5 feet away from me. She was bleeding from her brachial and femoral arteries. We stopped the bleeding. We got her the help we needed in the middle of the night under the moonlight. It was a horrific scene, obviously, as you can imagine, being next to an explosion and seeing this little girl cut to ribbons, knowing her mother's right next to her. So we were able to save her and do a lot of my experience in Colombia dealing with terrorism and bombings really helped out in that scene that night as well. So then I was promoted again, Washington, D.C., back to the West Coast as well. So there's a lot of experiences there where I had close to 15, almost 18 years of supervisor experience, some of it in the executive level and some of it at the street level, like a sergeant or a lieutenant. Other experiences, and then after I left the DEA, I became the chief of police at the University of Michigan, where I created the chief of police 10-point promise for sexual assault survivors, which I would hope would enhance the investigations we would do towards capturing individuals that assaulted students on campus. That was one of the crime-fighting techniques I came up with there and strategies. The other thing was, and I'm very proud of this, that I led the charge working side by side with the head of the Secret Service when President Barack Obama came here on May 1st, 2010 to give the commencement address. Many people don't know this, but that was the largest group of people in the history of the United States presidency to see a United States president in person outside of the Washington, D.C. area. So anywhere in the world, this was the largest group of people. It was amazing. Over 100,000 people. And so we had about 6 weeks to prepare. So the amount of preparation that went into that, working with the head of the Secret Service, as well as all the other entities and over 1,000 police officers from various police agencies throughout Southeast Michigan. It was phenomenal.
Wow.
It was phenomenal, and I'm very proud of that. My mother had a picture of me and President Obama on her nightstand until the day she passed away. But you'd never get a chance to do something like that. And so to be able to put that together, I'm proud of that. And that is something an experience that no one in law enforcement has been able to experience besides me.
Wow, that's a lot of accomplishment.
Thank you. And so one of my hobbies is I write books on Michigan football. I'm also a consultant for criminal justice. I work with various nonprofit agencies. We honor a military veteran at every home Michigan football game. It's quite an honor to give a presentation before the game. I'm the one giving the presentation to this veteran. It could be a 100-year-old World War II vet, or it could be a 70-year-old Vietnam vet. We've honored over 80 people. It's been amazing. And to see 100,000 people stand up on their feet and give the vet a standing ovation just sends chills. And I do some other work in the criminal justice area, and I'm involved with child safety and protection as well. And so those are my skill sets. The resume is online, as well as my tax returns. We believe in accountability and transparency. My tax returns for the last 2 years are online, as well as my complete resume. And I have released to any news entity that ever has asked for it my personnel files from various employers. I've got nothing to hide. I'm only proud of the things that I've done. And so,
total transparency.
Absolutely, 100%. Now, we'll talk about that in the platform issues here in a couple minutes.
Well, could you say something in Spanish to the audience?
Absolutely, I can. Señor Tyrone, Bridges. Bridges or Señor Puente. What I said is the name Bridges is Puente in Spanish, by the way. So, and I had a Spanish teacher in junior high. His name was Mr. Puente. So let's talk about things in Spanish for a minute. Lo siento mucho que yo tengo que hablar en español contigo porque tú no puedes entenderme. Pero mis amigos allá en Washtenaw County, yo quiero ayudar a ustedes para estar segura y enhance la seguridad de toda la county para ayudar a la gente que es hispánico y toda la otra gente que están viviendo aquí en Washtenaw County. Entonces, si tú quieres comunicar conmigo en español, yo estoy listo para hablar con ustedes cada día, cada hora de la noche. Mi número telefónico es en mi website y ojalá tú vas a llamarme si tienes un problema y podemos hablar. Gracias.
All right. In English, could you?
I basically said that I want to help all the people of Washtenaw County. I don't care who they are. I want to help them, and I want them to feel safe and secure and enhance security. And in the event that they need to talk to me, they can call my cell phone number, which is on my website as well.
All righty.
As well as any other listener can call my cell phone. It's everywhere. I'll always answer the phone. I'll always take somebody's call and try and get to the bottom or try and help them or listen to them. And that's how I will lead as the next sheriff.
All right. Now let's talk some recent murders that happened.
Okay.
In West Willow.
Okay.
What do you feel about the Supreme Felons?
Well, I've been pretty vocal about that. And we're going to talk about certain things when we get on the screen, my platform issues. But let's talk. You asked a question, I'm going to answer it. Do I believe people get a second chance? Absolutely. It's not me to decide who gets a second chance. If you go to prison and the parole board says your time is up, you can come back to the community, I'm all for it. I don't think those people should be harassed. I think they should be given help. They should be able to give them the social services to integrate back into the community. And hopefully we can find felony-friendly employers to get them jobs. One of the things I said that I was going to do was find 30 felony-friendly employers in the first 30 days of my administration, because I know a lot of people, and I can do that. So that's one of my goals. But you asked a question specifically about the Supreme Felons. It's been well documented that Supreme Felons was an idea created by Derek Jackson. And there's proof and messages through Freedom of Information that Derek Jackson created this program to support the Supreme Felons, and $1.2 million of ARPA funds was given to the Supreme Felons. Let's talk about the two leaders that was given to in the very beginning. One was Alan Fuqua, who was a convicted
Fuquay. Yeah.
Fuquay, who was a convicted sexual offender who did well over a decade and a half in prison for molestation and sexual assault. The other was a convicted murderer, Mr. Billy Cole. Do I think Mr. Cole's going to murder somebody again? No, I don't. I don't think that. But what I will do is I will look back and say what happened. And what happened was, when he was a young man, he robbed a liquor store in Ypsilanti, took the money, less than $100, somewhere around there, put the person on his knees, tied him up, a young man by the name of Mark Simpson, who was 24 years old, tied him up. Instead of leaving, he didn't want any witnesses, and he put 2 bullets in his head. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years, and somehow the parole board ultimately decided after 40-some years, Mr. Cole should return to society. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is our sheriff's department and our leaders at the sheriff's department creating this program and giving $1.2 million to those individuals that have been out of prison for less than 2 years, when there were so many other programs, for example, domestic violence programs that Nicole Beverly was running. She's a proven leader in the field of helping women in domestic violence. She didn't get any money from the grant. $1.2 million was approved without a question being asked. And then when it started to come to light, they immediately took the sex offender off the list of people running the organization because, a sex offender can't go into schools, and neither can a convicted felon. But our law enforcement leadership is now embracing the supreme felons like they're rock stars. You have our sheriff and you have Derek Jackson having dinner with them, toasting them. I'd like to remind people that Mark Simpson, who died at the age of 24, had a family. And I've never heard them talking about Mark Simpson. I have a problem with that because as law enforcement, when I'm a leader in charge, my first priority will always be the victims, and I will never forget those victims. And it seems to me that Mr. Jackson, in his rush to do the things that he thinks are good, has forgotten a lot of things that fly in the face of law enforcement. His strategies are flawed. Crime continues to rise. Murders continue to occur, 22 of them last year, 21 shootings here in this county in the last 78 days. And then you talk about the 2 murders the other day. And to put all your chips on the table to say the way we're going to solve the crime problem is a group of convicted felons that create this phrase, the supreme felons. And I get calls from the community who fear the supreme felons. They don't trust them. And rightfully so. And there's a reason why we do background investigations at law enforcement agencies. And that is to get the best people and to make sure that their background is spotless. And so what happens is you've got Mr. Jackson promoting the supreme felons, pushing $1.2 million through. And I believe, partially, that part of this was just to help his campaign. That's my personal opinion, number one. Number two, he's pushing them through. And number three is Mr. Jackson has created this program called the Community Reentry Program, okay? Or the Corrections Reentry Program, one of the two, where he's hired numerous convicted felons to work at the Sheriff's Department. Let me tell Mr. Jackson something. There's a lot of people that feel extremely uncomfortable with the Sheriff's Office because you're employing convicted felons. Once again, why don't you employ victims? Why don't we work on employing the victims and getting them the justice that they need? Now, do I believe that the returning citizens from prison get second chances? Absolutely. But there's a certain standard at a law enforcement agency you have to uphold. And I've asked Mr. Jackson this question in a forum, and I know other people have asked him this question, and what he refuses to answer is how many of those felons that you've hired at the Sheriff's Department have been rearrested for crimes while they were employed at the Sheriff's Department? Answer that question, Mr. Jackson, and if you ever get him on this show, I hope you ask him that question, because he won't answer it. And I can tell you, they've been arrested because I get the phone calls about it. Why? Because people just can't believe some of the shenanigans that are going on under Derek Jackson's watch at the Sheriff's Department. There's no accountability. There's no transparency. Let me talk briefly about shenanigans. The other day when I called him out about not being a police officer, what he did after that, while I continued to speak in front of over 100 people, my back was turned to him, I was still speaking, he pulls out a police badge, a sheriff's badge, and starts waving it to the crowd and laughing. Alicia Dyer was standing right next to him. And he's grinning like he's standing behind the kindergarten teacher making a silly face. Alicia leaned over to him. Her exact words she told me was, I told him, put that shit away. She told him to put his badge away, and he said, I'm sorry, I just couldn't help myself. First off, what Mr. Jackson needs to know that utilizing a police badge like that, number one, is a violation of policy. And number two, if you look at the law, it's basically political electioneering, influencing election, using a police badge, an issued item to enhance your credibility in a political race. Got a problem with that?
Wow.
You should never use your badge like that, ever, especially in a political forum. And let's talk about accountability and transparency. I know the sheriff knows about it. I know the undersheriff knows about it. Was he held accountable for it? Was he given a letter of reprimand? Most other cops on the force, if they did that, they would have been fired. So, you asked me the question about the Supreme Felons. We briefly segued back because I wanted to talk about the badge story. But that's my concern about the Supreme Felons. Do I think community engagement is important? Absolutely. Do I believe in community violence intervention? Absolutely. Do I think there's ways to do it? Yes. I don't believe giving millions of dollars to a group of convicted felons who just got out of prison for heinous crimes and creating this whole thing is the way to solve the problems here in the community.
So the biggest thing is the sheriff department, they don't need to be at the sheriff department at all.
No, I don't. I think that what you should do is really focus. Focus on your officers and focus on crime-fighting strategies, because one of the best ways to prevent crime is to lock up criminals that are committing series of crimes. And there's ways to do it. And I've never heard Derek Jackson talk once about it, nor have I heard Alicia talk about it. Why? Because they've never created the strategies. And I have 3+ decades creating strategies to fight crime. We will never stop crime. And anybody who says we will, they're lying to you. We will never stop it, but we can make an impact. Crime has been going on for centuries. It's human nature that other humans sometimes will take advantage of other individuals. It's our goal as law enforcement leaders to create strategies to have an impact on that. So when I read a message the other night that Mr. Jackson, my opponent, sent out that said, crime is not a police problem, my jaw about hit the ground, where he explains some story where he talks about having his hands in the soil of the community. And I'm thinking to myself, why aren't we talking about creating strategies to fight crime? Community violence intervention is a small strategy over here. But there's ways that cops can take guns off the street, drugs off the street, and create a much healthier and happy neighborhood, crime-free neighborhood, or crime-reduced neighborhood, as long as you've got the support of law enforcement. So that's my opinion, and
then
I'm pretty direct on it.
Then you could create a transparent police force. This is Ken Magee. This is my I would say my friend. This is my friend. This is my I'd say I'm gonna be voting for this man here.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But you know why you're voting for me? Besides everything I've told you, are we going to have time to talk about a few of the platform issues?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. And because I've discussed with you my platform. Okay. I'm talking about my ideas to create, for example, I don't believe in traffic enforcement. I believe it penalizes people versus educating. I want to create a traffic enforcement program that's really called traffic education, where instead of getting tickets, you get educational warnings and you take a class online. And for a lot of people, $200 isn't much. They pay this ticket, they pay the $200. Let me give you a story about a marginalized kid named Johnny. Comes from a poor family. Johnny's driving, he gets a speeding ticket. He has to pay $200. He can't pay the ticket. So what happens? He gets a suspended license. You get a suspended license, you can't get insurance. Can't get insurance, you can't get a job or car. Can't get a car, you can't get a job. And what happens? You might drive the car illegally now, get another ticket, and you start to spiral out of control. My plan is, when he gets that ticket, instead of paying $200, he goes, takes an educational seminar online, and he learns the difference. And if he stays clean and doesn't get another traffic enforcement violation within the next 18 months, that ticket disappears. That $200 that we save him can, A, educate him, number one. Number two is stop him from spiraling out of control later on. So that's number one. These are my platform issues. They're not in any order the way that we're having this interview. But the next one is, we have a huge opioid epidemic. Opioids have killed well over 500 people in a little more than a half a decade. Here in our county, over 100,000 people nationwide. Right now, there's no real hardcore effort for law enforcement to attack the opioid problem. I know that we're not going to arrest our way out of the situation. I lost a brother to a heroin overdose and opioids. I know what it's like. I've seen victims in my own family. I know what it's like. So my years of watching the entire system work, I look at things and I created a strategy. It's called PETER. It stands for Prevention, Enforcement, Treatment, Education, and Recovery. And each one of those is a certain component that I've experienced all of them by mentoring young people that had drug problems, to enforcing the laws, to serving on prevention boards and things of that nature. I've experienced all of them. You might say, what does the sheriff have to do with recovery? Well, as long as the sheriff is the elected official, he has the power to hopefully bring and build relationships and bring everybody to the table to follow that acronym so we can work together. I don't want to arrest low-level drug users. I don't want to do that. But there are low-level drug users that end up in jail for other crimes. I want to take half of our jail and turn it into a recovery unit. So why would I do that? Because if they're there for 30, 60, 90 days or 180 days, we can give them intense training. How am I going to pay for the substance use disorders counselors that are going to be there? I'm going to get rid of some of these high-paying jobs at the sheriff's department that are just fluff, that insulate the sheriff. So the other day, I heard in your interview, Ms. Dyer said that I was more conservative. Why am I conservative? Why am I more conservative? Well, law enforcement is a conservative field. But let me ask you this, Tyrone. Does that sound conservative? I think it sounds pretty progressive, taking a jail and turning half of it into a recovery unit, as well as stopping traffic enforcement to help many of our marginalized communities address some of the concerns that they have in regards to traffic enforcement.
Right.
And those are two things that are revolutionary in regards to other people say, where did you come up with that idea? And I say this, and that is, in order to be an effective law enforcement leader in today's day and age, you have to have the ability to think outside the badge. Maintain your traditional values as a law enforcement officer, not flashing your badge, not doing things that are inappropriate, not lying about your credentials. Being a traditional police officer where you have the values that you're going to do the right thing at the right time all the time, but also borrowing from other modalities. Yes, we can borrow a little from the social worker field. We can borrow from the educational field. We can borrow from the military field. We can borrow from the financial field. We can borrow things from the advertisement field, media and advertising. We can put all those things, we borrow those and have an effective law enforcement agency and an effective leader by thinking outside the badge. So that's the way I look at things. So as we move back to my platform issues, we've talked about opioids, we've talked about traffic enforcement and versus education. Then I talked about transparency. Accountability and transparency is huge. Freedom of information requests cost you sometimes hundreds of dollars to get reports. God forbid you want to watch video body camera, it's going to cost you a fortune. I have created ideas and a strategy to allow the public to see some of these items more frequently, easier, without jeopardizing the system, without jeopardizing the integrity of investigations, while allowing the public to see information without these exorbitant costs that we've talked about. So, accountability, transparency, drugs, traffic enforcement. Let's talk about gun violence. We don't talk a lot about gun violence, except for when people get murdered. Well, I hear so much about it, but what I don't hear about is strategies to combat it, except for community violence intervention, which is going to be a part of my strategy. But there's also enforcement of gun laws and holding people accountable that are using weapons illegally, stolen weapons, selling stolen weapons, stealing weapons, list after list after list after list, using weapons in commission of crimes. How do we stop that? Through crime-fighting strategies, which I've developed, which I've done nationwide. And it's the exact same thing. It's creating multi-jurisdictional task forces. For example, I was on a task force where we took sexual offenders off the street, child abusers. where we worked with the United States Marshal's Office and other groups of people, a multi-jurisdictional task force that took off hundreds of sexual abusers of children in a week by working hard for 3 months beforehand. And those are the kind of strategies and skill sets that I bring to the table. So, accountability and transparency, gun violence, which is also targeting individuals that have committed numerous acts of domestic violence. In Washtenaw County, you're 5 times more likely now to be a victim of death if you're a victim of domestic violence than you were several years ago.
Wow.
There's that. Number 3 is I've talked to you about the drug problem. 4 years ago, I was in a debate with Jerry Clayton, and he looked at me and he said, let's face it, Mr. Magee is talking about the opioid crisis now that it's impacting white people. That's a slap in the face to anyone, black or white. Why? Because when you care about people, you don't look at the color, you look at them as a human being. And what Mr. Clayton didn't realize, which I did realize because I study crime trends, is that opioids were increasing and continue to increase. And now, if you're an African American, you're 80% more likely to die of an opioid overdose than you were 4 years ago. And if you're Hispanic, 40%, because that's what the data shows. So had they jumped on that 4 years ago, maybe we would have a situation where less young black men were dying of overdoses, Hispanics as well as white individuals, because I'm not looking at color, I'm looking at people. So, accountability, transparency, traffic enforcement, opioids, gun violence, and then other programs deal with working with our youth that are runaways, and because I believe if you're a runaway, you're running from something 90% of the time, whether it be domestic violence within a household, sexual abuse, mental abuse, and those are some of the things I'm concerned about. And because if you're running from something, you're probably running from one of those. Are there some incorrigible kids? Absolutely. Are they salvageable? Absolutely. But if we don't look for them, and if we don't get them the help that they need, then they're going to become what? Victims of the industry of drugs, human trafficking, becoming sex workers, and the kind of things that we don't want any of our kids to get involved in. So those are my basic 5 platform points. And when you take a look at my entire strategy, it's all about fighting crime in a variety of different ways and helping individuals with 30 years of experience backing up my strategies, successful experiences, and at some of the highest levels. So I also, it was said recently in a forum that I didn't work in Washtenaw County at the Sheriff's Department. I'd like to point out I was a chief of police in Washtenaw County, and I oversaw numerous law enforcement officers, and I lived in Washtenaw County in Ypsilanti Township when I was a federal agent. I've arrested one of the highest drug dealers in the history of Michigan right here in Washtenaw County, a guy named Reginald Gary Davis. So I have my experience in Washtenaw County, and let's face it, we're looking at Washtenaw County. Washtenaw County is no different than any other county, as much as we'd like to think it. Criminals operate the same way. Victims are still preyed on, and law enforcement strategies should be very sound and convincing when you've got decades of experience and decades of training behind it. And that's what I bring to the table. So, hopefully you still want to vote for me after I really laid out those 5 platform issues. And there's so much more. However, those are the 5 platform issues. I want to tell you one thing, though, what's really important for you to understand, and what's important for all the viewers out there watching, and that is right now in Washtenaw County, we are on the verge of a law enforcement crisis. And what does that mean? The Sheriff's Department has 96 employees, 96 Sheriff's Office deputies, sworn employees. There are much more employees, but 96 deputies working the road. They are down 25 deputies, which puts you at 71. They only have 4 people in the academy. That would put you at 75. And at the beginning of January 1st, 2025, when I take office, there have already been 10 people who have announced that they plan on retiring. So what does that mean? We're down almost 35 officers next year on January 1st. I have a plan to address that. Why are they leaving? Some are retiring. The morale is horrible at the sheriff's department. I get phone calls all the time. They feel that leadership has failed them. They have concerns about leadership. They have concerns about the future. And they have concerns that my opponents don't talk about them, with the exception of talking about their mental health. There's no strategy to bring relief. The best way to help the mental health of a police officer is have effective leadership. And the best way to have effective leadership is have leadership that's respected. And how are you respected? You've been there, you've done that, you've done it for 30 years, and you know exactly what they go through. And I'm sorry, when one person has 6.4 years that didn't pass the sheriff's examination and the other was never made an arrest, that's not the experience they're looking for. They're looking for the guys that have worked the middle of the nights, captured some of the world's worst criminals, put their lives on the line every day for 30 years, and even had hits put on their life because they're doing an effective job. So it's important for your viewers to understand we are on the verge of a law enforcement crisis. Imagine what's going to happen when we're well over 30% down officers. Imagine that. Why? They don't get the support. I've talked about all those things earlier, and I plan on enhancing things tremendously. I have a plan to bring officers to Washtenaw County and get them here quickly. And I know I'll be able to do it, and I know I'll be effective, and I've already been recruiting people for when I take office January 1st.
All right. All right. Any last words, Ken?
Sure, I have one last thing I'd like to say. That at the end of the day, when people are getting ready to vote, when you actually decide who you're going to vote for, you've got to ask yourself this question. Do you want a law enforcement leader running a law enforcement agency, or do you want a social worker? That's the question. Because at the end of the day, it should always be a law enforcement leader running a law enforcement agency. Thank you. Appreciate it.